Hello everyone. Today we will be discussing the third section of chapter 12 and discussing the different approaches to describing how personality develops and our own self-image. And so to begin with, we will discuss humanistic and existential approaches to personality. Both humanistic and existential theorists focus on how healthy choices create our personality. So in the 1950s and 60s, psychologists turned their attention to how humans make healthy choices that impact and create their personalities. So humanistic psychologists emphasize the positive, optimistic view of human nature that highlight people's inherent goodness and potential for personal growth. And this is synonymous with the approach. Something that is synonymous with the approach is Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And this is where he believed that people must first meet their basic needs like food, clothing, and shelter before progressing to the next level in the hierarchy, with the ultimate goal of self-actualization involving finding purpose and meaning to one's own life. So as we have experienced, it feels good to do things that challenge our abilities, but that really don't challenge our abilities too much to where we just become overwhelmed. So humanists believe that such peak experiences or states of flow reflect the realization of one's human potential and represent the height of personality development. So when you're in a class that's not very challenging and you do not utilize your abilities, you're oftentimes bored. If you're in a class that's very challenging and you do not have the ability to succeed, you experience anxiety. But if it's not really until you're in the class that is challenging yet you're able to keep up by being on your toes and using your abilities, this is when you experience that flow. So the existential psychologists, however, focus on the individual as being a responsible agent who is free to create and live his or her life while negotiating the issue of meaning, so life's meaning and reality of death. And so angst is the anxiety of fully being, and it occurs when we experience difficulties in finding that meaning to our lives and start taking responsibility for our own decisions. And so the humanistic existential approach integrates these insights with a focus on how to optimize one's own personality. And so here we have the social cognitive approach, and this brings together social psychology, cognitive psychology, and learning theory. So they agree with behaviorists in that situations cause behavior, and reinforcement for behavior leads to learning, which predicts future behavior. They go farther by saying that personality, or how you perceive the environment, interacts with situations and learning to determine your behavior. So the social cognitive approach focuses on how personality and situations interact to cause behavior, how personality contributes to the way people construct situations in their own minds, and how people's goals and expectancies influence their response to situations. And so we'll talk about each little piece of this throughout the presentation. But one example is if you go into a situation and you're in a bad mood, you would most likely interact with people differently than if you were excited and happy to see everyone within that setting. So further complicating this approach is research conducted by Walter Mischel in 1968, and he argued that personality traits that we measure often do a poor job predicting an individual's behavior. And he found that an average correlation between personality traits and behavior is weak. And so his research suggested that people behave differently in one situation than they do in others, and that behaviors are determined more by situational factors rather than just one's personality. So people's goals are determined partially by outcome expectancies, or the person's assumptions about the likely consequences of a future behavior. And so this is learned through direct experience and through observing others. So these expectancies combine with goals to produce one's characteristic style of behavior. So for example, if we want to make friends and you believe people are inherently good and nice, your route to gaining friendship will be different from someone who believes that people are that they shamelessly promote themselves all the time. We would have a different route to gaining friendship than that individual. So thus our personalities determine the way we pursue our goals. And so we also see that people also differ in their expectancy of outcomes. So some people believe they are fully in control of what happens to them in life and are said to have an internal locus of control, whereas those who believe the world gives out rewards and punishment regardless of their behavior have an external locus of control. So if you failed an exam, for example, are you more apt to blaming yourself for not studying till the night before the exam, or do you put blame on others in the world, like my car broke down, my boyfriend or girlfriend just broke up with me, so I can't concentrate, and I have no control over what happens. That would be the difference between internal or the self and external or the environment types of locus of control. So turning towards the self, we develop this ability to recognize ourselves in the mirror by 18 months of age. And so the ability, this one ability signals a capacity for reflexive thinking by directing our own attention towards our thoughts, feelings, and actions. So these observations of our own behavior draw on what we think about ourselves, which is known as self-concept, and how we feel about ourselves, known as our self-esteem. So William James in 1890s described self-concept as having me features that make up one's self-concept, like explicit knowledge of one's own behaviors, traits, and other personal characteristics. So it's developed through social experiences and has profound effects on a person's behavior throughout their life. So for example, how people see you in the world, like physical characteristics, whether you're female, male, tall, short, dark-skinned, light-skinned, personality traits, extroverted, introverted, agreeable, neurotic, social roles like being a student, a daughter, a son, a hiking club member, a gym manager. These me features are largely constructed through your relationships with other people. And the I features are what happen internally, so your thoughts about yourself, or your thoughts about your thoughts. So we gain self-knowledge through private moments of insight, interacting with others, like feedback from our teachers, our siblings, our friends. And we begin to accumulate all of the things that people have said into a consensus of what makes up our self-concept. And this concept becomes more stable over time. So I believe I'm a nice person, I'm very thoughtful, and so on and so on. And our self-concept affects us and our behavior by promoting consistency in our behavior across situations. And so existential theorists emphasize that people derive comfort from knowing how they are. So because it gives us a sense of familiarity and stability. So we also engage in this type of self-verification process, which is the tendency to seek evidence to confirm our self-concept. So what we find is that it's often disconcerting if someone sees us quite differently from the way we see ourselves. So if I see myself as a nice, thoughtful person, but someone tells me that I'm mean and I'm self-centered, then I'm going to have a very tough time with that, because that's not how I see myself. Self-esteem is the extent to which an individual likes, values, and accepts themselves. So if people believe that the way they act or feel falls short of their ideal self, people tend to feel sad or dejected. And so some research suggests that high self-esteem arises from primarily being accepted and valued by significant others in your life. So others focus on the influence of specific self-evaluations or judgments about your own value or competence in specific domains like appearance, athletics, or academic achievement. So it can either come from yourself and how you value yourself or judge yourself, and it could also come from others that are significant in your life. unconscious perspectives we take can also affect our sense of self-worth, and this depends partially on which domains are most important to the individual's self-concept. So which does the individual value more, academic achievement or physical attractiveness or athletic ability? So one example of this could be if you suck at playing flag football, yet you put all of your time and effort into academic achievement, it may not affect your self-esteem because you don't draw your self-esteem or your self-worth from playing in sports. But you do, however, gain your self-worth and your self-esteem from excelling in the classroom. So it can depend on what type of situation you're in. Evolutionary theory holds that early humans who managed to survive were those that were able to maintain good relationships with others. So self-esteem could then be a kind of sociometer or inner gauge of how a person feels included by others at any given moment. So we seek higher self-esteem then because we have evolved to seek out belongingness in our families, work groups, and culture, and higher self-esteem indicates that we're being accepted by meaningful people in our lives. For whatever reason, people generally are motivated to see themselves positively. So interestingly, we often process information in a biased manner in order to feel good about ourselves, and this is known as the self-serving bias. So the self-serving bias is where people tend to take credit for their successes but downplay responsibility for their failures. So one would be, I studied really intensely for that exam and I'm just really good at that subject, versus the test was ridiculously tricky. So when something good happens, it's because of me, but when something bad happens, it's because of you. Most people see themselves as better than the average person in most domains, which we know cannot be accurate statistically speaking, but may be adaptive to avoid depressive symptoms, anxious symptoms, and other health-related problems. And so with that, that wraps up the third section of Chapter 12.